Hello everyone. Good evening all. This is Vinodini here, a member in Suk Chennai. So it's privileged to have Akshay Shura, who is partner at Konabos Consulting and also a Sitecore MVP in commerce. He'll take us through the webinar on integrate with Sitecore Content Hub from an external application. On behalf of Suk Chennai, welcoming Akshay for the webinar, extending my warm welcome to all the participants. Over to Akshay. We are excited to hear from you.
Hi, thank you. Hey guys, so today we'll be talking about how to integrate with Content Hub from external applications, whether they are Sitecore based or .NET based, it really doesn't matter. My name is Akshay Sura. I've been doing Sitecore for over 13 years, been part of the community, so I'm available through all social channels if you need any questions answered or need some guidance. So there's two ways to integrate into Content Hub. One is the REST API. The other one is a web client SDK. From a REST API perspective, just like other APIs out there, there's no external libraries. You can call as many APIs as you wish, mix and match different APIs to suit your needs. So if you're trying to get to a specific functionality, you might have to end up calling multiple APIs to get that functionality done. It's more like you have all the ingredients and you essentially bake your cake based on it, but you can also use it to make muffins or whatever you need to. The documentation for REST-based API is very clear on the Style Labs website. Once you go through some of the basic training for Content Hub, things would start making a better sense of how exactly to use it. But there are some examples out there and you could start playing with these. So because of the nature of the REST APIs, you can play with these on using your Postman. As long as you authenticate, you should be, you don't really need anything else to just make a call. But in order to make these calls, though, first you need to create a user who has access to things. So maybe like an API user with enough privileges. You also need to be able to add or use an existing OAuth client. So when you try to authenticate, usually you can authenticate several different ways. But one of the ways I like authenticating, you have to provide your OAuth token as well as your username password for the API user. So here you're basically using an existing OAuth client and the client secret. And then you could use that info and Postman or any other client, and then you could make your API calls. Now, again, just because it's a REST API call, any technology out there which can make a web call, you should be able to integrate this into it. So IoT devices, Java, it doesn't really make any difference as long as you can make that call. So it's pretty broad, it's open, and there's no restriction from that perspective. From an SDK perspective, there is a JavaScript SDK. The documentation, again, is on the same exact site on Style Labs. I have not personally used the JavaScript SDK at this moment, but the option is available. The second part of the Web Client SDK is the libraries which are available via NuGet packages. So these are external. You would need to bring it into your project or solution. So if you're working on Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio itself, you can bring these NuGet packages in. These have functionality already built in, so you don't have to do low-level calls like connecting to an API, authenticating. Some of those are extracted out, and it's pretty easy. You don't have to do many of the little things. The calls are already there. There's pre-built functionality already in there. It's easy to integrate, so it's almost like a box of cake if you've used that before. So you just have to mix the ingredients and push it in the oven and you're done. The documentation for the Web Client SDK, again, the URL below, it's on the Style Labs website. Pretty straightforward. The only caveat to this is it is on a gated NuGet feed. So this NuGet feed isn't available publicly unless you know exactly the URL you need to get to. And once you have access to this, you should be able to add it as a source in your Visual Studio. And then you should be able to pull that in. I have used it on several different types of projects. I mainly use it for my Azure functions for this. You could use it on a straight .NET Core API as well. It really doesn't matter. As long as you can pull this NuGet feed in and it's compatible with your project type, you should be able to use that. There is a very old example of a project available on the Style Labs GitHub. Again, a lot of the API has modified just a little bit, but it should be a good starting point for you to take a look into how they were trying to give you an example and build upon that. One of the interesting things about the Web Client SDK is that even though the functionality is pre-built, you can also make raw API calls. So by using the mconnector.client.raw, you could make plain HTTP calls out. So you could do a combination of the Web Client SDK and some API calls if that's what you choose to do. A couple of the main entities in Content Hub, and I think once you get into it a little bit more, it makes more sense. It just seems too much if you have not touched any of this. There's several entities. The three main are the m.asset, which is mainly in the DAM. It's any asset in terms of image, PDFs, videos, anything you use as an asset. And the definition for what gets stored for an asset is stored in the m.asset. m.pc, m.product is the second entity we're talking about. It's basically used to store product information. There's other entities for product family, asset type, and things of that sort. And then the last one is m.content, which is what CMP stores information in, Content Marketing Platform. And basically what that is it stores different types of info. So you have the base m.content, and then you have a type. So blog, article, author, all of those could be types of m.content. Before we get into the demo portion of it, just to kind of go over relationships, and as part of the demo, you can see how Content Hub stores all these. There's the way it stores information. Content Hub stores information is you have multiple entities and you have relation objects between entities. So just like your old SQL days, you have one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. And essentially you specify the entities for that relationship. So if it's one-to-one, it's parent and children, one-to-many, one parent, many children, things of that sort. It's very easy once you get into it. It's annoying and difficult when you're looking for it from the outside when you have not touched it. So from a demo perspective, I wanted to quickly show you guys. I'm not sure how many of you have used Content Hub or not, but I just wanted to quickly go over it. So this is the first screen you get to in Content Hub, and every single screen on here is customizable. So it's, you could make it look exactly how you want. You can make the background, the colors, the CSS, and what gets displayed on every single page. You could control it if you choose to. Depending on the products your company gets, so there's PCM, Product Content Management, CMP, which is Content Marketing Platform, DAM, which is digital asset management, and MRM, marketing resource management. So depending on what you get, things will show up on here. So from a products perspective, you have catalogs. Again, you could have multiple catalogs, product families. You could have multiple product families. These are basically categories, for instance. And then there's products. So each product can have its metadata, and then it will link to a catalog. It could link to one or more product families as well, and product can link to assets. So, product has images, specs, plans, or whatever you want to call it. So you could attach it to the assets in DAM. It could also link to pieces of content in CMP. So product might link to maybe designers, for instance, which could be a content type in CMP, and you could attach that. Assets by far is the biggest chunk of it, and each asset is DAM by itself is pretty big, and you could do a ton on DAM. But essentially, it's a place where you upload your assets. It has some metadata by default. You could add some image processing to analyze your asset. So maybe you want AI to look at it, bring up colors or tags related to an asset. You could add additional metadata to each one of these if you choose to. And again, DAM, I think, to me, is one of the more complicated ones. And then the final piece is the CMP. So from a CMP perspective, if you take a look, I created a custom CMP type called user group. And it really doesn't have a lot of info, but it has 3 pieces of info. But again, I didn't customize it too much. So it has a title, details, and the date. You could attach assets if you choose to. I did not customize anything in the strategy or the details, but you could if you choose to. And essentially, these pieces of information get stored. Stop that and then show you. So the interesting part about Content Hub is that everything gets stored relationally, and you can traverse through a particular entity and then look at all the relationships you have and go to those relationships. So for instance, this entity at this moment is a content of type user group. And if I look at the definition for it from an API perspective, we know the content's name, we know the details and the date stamp. And as you notice, some of these inbuilt types which are already there, the names of the fields look a little bit different because we added them. So that's one differentiator. We know the ID of it. And then if you look at several different things, you can see which campaigns it's related to. This is a very important relationships, content type to content. So every piece of content inside of CMP has to have a type. So in this case, the content type is user group. If you wanted to look at the definition for user group, for instance, of how it was defined, so this is the definition for it. It has its own relationships and so on and so forth. So once you start getting into the API or the Web Client SDK, it gets easier. Most of the time I spend when I'm writing any code for the API or the Web Client SDK in this screen, because you're trying to figure out. So I go in here, add all the things I needed to, come back in here, take a look, see how they're actually related to each other in order for me to relate, for instance, a content lifecycle. So maybe I want to put some piece of content in approved straight away. So for me to come in here and see, okay, it makes sense. I can see that I need to add a relationship for content lifecycle to content, and then it's a parent to child relationship, and then I need to specify the content lifecycle label. So, and then you need to know the ID of that. So it kind of gets easier once you get into it, but like I said, initially it's a pain. Most of the work which you probably end up doing setting up Content Hub would be in content types, and then there's also schema and taxonomy, which we can go through. Some of them come pre-built, so these content types come by default. The ones like Bruce, promotion, and user group are the ones I added, and you can define what you want in that content type. So this is the content section. So content section members are pretty simple. Those are the sections you saw on the left where the user fills in main content types, so you can only see those. But on the right where you saw the details, you could add fields of complicated types. For instance, apart from all of this, if you want an option list, so this is basically like a drop down with about 10 values or so. And then taxonomy is a little bit more complicated than option list. It could be a hierarchical list of values you pick, one or more, for which suits that that content item. So you can define it whichever way you choose to. But when you look at the schema, which is where you spend most of your time, so m.asset defines the schema which will be stored for an asset, for instance, an image or PDF or whatever that is. So you have a definition of all the attributes which get stored, and as you look through it, it's quite a bit of attributes. But what you can do, depending, you could have as many as you want, but what you could do is, instead of cluttering the screen with all kinds of stuff, when you open an asset, you could just make it look like how you want it to, depending on logic. So you could add a lot of conditional logic in here where you could say only show, for instance, promotional details if this item is of type X, or you only show product section under m.asset only if the product type of this asset is set to product, for instance. So you could do quite a bit of conditional logic, and as you get into it, you could do more and more. Taxonomy is where you specify the taxonomy of, you can create definitions of taxonomy. So let's see if we can have, so asset type, like we saw, there's a field called asset type, and you could have a list of values. So for instance, archive is one of them, social media asset is one of them, but you could also have hierarchical. So branding asset has children under it, so brand guidelines, font asset. So you could set a hierarchical taxonomy. It gets pretty easy once you start getting into it. And then there's pages where you can go in and customize every single page which is currently on this site, and it gets easy. There's a few audit logs which kind of tell you all the events which are taking place, and then there's scripts where you can write scripts or modify existing scripts of what happens, actions and triggers, and we can go on and on. But what I want to do next is I want to get back in here. And currently, I just have 3 pieces of content. One is in a final state. The other 2 are in progress. And as you can see, there is no item for the Sitecore user group Chennai, right? So what I'll do is I have this sample application, which basically uses the API, and we'll walk through the code real quick shortly after this. I'm going to add some information about this session, and then we will add it, and we'll see it magically appear. All right, so do that. Hit user group. Hit OK. All right, and then we come back here, and then we just refresh. And as you can see, we created our content of type user group. It seems easy, and it's actually very, very easy. It's really not that difficult at all. So if you look at the piece of code for this, all I'm trying to do, and I try to get my work done in Azure Functions for various reasons, and this could be just your local, the Forms app, which you saw could be doing this, but I chose to put it in a queue. So when you're trying to deal with thousands of items, right? So I wrote this sample app to move data between a Sitecore XP instance and Content Hub. So this sample app is capable of pushing your existing content from Sitecore into Content Hub, including assets. It can pull products from external systems and push it to Content Hub as well. And when you're doing that, it kind of gets lengthy in terms of process. So from a product perspective, you are adding a product family, then you create a product, which is fine. But when you look at it from an asset perspective, what happens is you go through, I'm not going to go through the entire code, but when you go through and create the product, the asset, set all the metadata for it, the one thing which takes long is you're trying to fetch the asset. So one of the ways you do it via the API, actually the only way you do it through the API, is providing a public URL for the asset. And what happens is you need to create a job in Content Hub to say, hey, I created the asset right now, but go get me the actual file, and here's the URL to get it. Now, when you do that, it might take 1 second, it might take 50 seconds, it might take 3 minutes, depending on the size of your asset. So if it's 50 meg or 1 gig or however big your assets are, it might take time. And what happens is, once you create a fetch job, in order to finish your process, you need to sit there and constantly keep checking. Are you done? Are you done? Are you done? So I have a timed job which just sits there, checks every 15 seconds, or actually the amount of seconds can be configured, but it just checks for it, waits, and then if it's done, it puts it in a different queue, and then we know that the process is done. Now, if I were to do this on my local with the .NET Core app, for instance, I have to spin up multiple threads. Each thread has to wait on the finishing of a specific task. It just gets too complicated, and when you're dealing with thousands of items, so imagine your existing media library for a site which has been live for a few years would have thousands of items, if not more. So if you are pushing all of that out, it takes a long time, and I don't want to be sitting on a machine and depending on a machine to do it, or a local machine to do it. So I'd rather push all of these jobs out to Azure. So that's what I usually tend to do. So from coming back to our code for adding the user group, it's super easy. So I'm pushing a JSON value into the queue on Azure. This function gets triggered. I'm connecting to the web client through the web client SDK to Content Hub. So specifying the host, the client ID, secret, username, password. Once I connect to it, I'm impersonating a user. The reason why you usually end up doing that is if you have set workflows and you want to follow the workflow, if I create something as a user admin, and I'm able to do multiple things to that piece of content, but if you want it to be restricted to what a specific user can do, who falls under a specific role, who has to follow a specific rule, you usually tend to do that. So in order to follow that, I typically try to impersonate the user, and then you create an entity of a specific type, and these types are all definitions, are pretty much IDs in a way as to the definitions, but they're text. So there's a bunch of this. So for blog, it's a different definition type to this, and as you can see, the definition for a user group is different again because we manually created it. So the field names look different than what comes out of the system. But essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create an entity of m.content, specify the values which we have. Now that we did that, what we need to do is we created a relationship of type child to parent. So one-to-one relationship between child to parent, and we assigned the type of content, which is user group. We are also adding a lifecycle process, so we want to make sure that it falls into a specific lifecycle process, which is in progress, and it just from that point on, the content authors can take it forward, and also the state of that piece of content. Once we're done with that, we save the entity again with this call, and then that's pretty much it. The whole thing runs pretty fast. As you can see, it really doesn't take that long for us to get a piece of content out there at all. Let me come back here. So that's pretty much it from a demo perspective. Again, it's kind of hard if you have not done Content Hub, but as you're doing it, it gets a little bit easier. There's a few webinars out there. So we released these webinars recently, both in the APAC region as well as in the North American region. So if you're interested in hearing more about Content Hub or how it can be utilized, these won't be so developer oriented, but in general about Content Hub, what the process is of looking at Content Hub as a prospect. What do you go through in terms of process? How does your information end up getting onto Content Hub, the data models and things of that sort? That's what's in the look before you leave. The supercharged one is more about the strategy behind storing products, the content related to products. How do you deal with thousands of products with thousands of assets associated with them, and just make your life a little bit easier? So you could go to the konabos.com/webinars and sign up. There's also a Sitecore Symposium talk I'm doing with Sumit, who's based in Europe. He's the product manager for multiple things, CMP connector being one of them. So there is a connector between Sitecore XP and CMP, which brings in the Content Hub. So all the user groups, for instance, which we've added, we could sync it back into a Sitecore CMS and then write the UI to display those on the front end website. So that's just an example, but you could pull in blogs, articles, whatever you need to. So this specific talk on the symposium is specific to the CMP connector. And if you are currently working on it or hoping to work on it, there's a couple of really nice talks about Content Hub for the symposium. So you could check it out over there. And again, there's several public channels you could reach me on, but we produce quite a bit of content in our blogs and our videos. So you could subscribe to that. You could reach out to me on Slack or Twitter or LinkedIn. I'll be more than happy to guide you based on what I know, or I can guide you to push you to people who probably know more than I do. Anyway, so that's the end of my presentation. If you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer it for you guys. Anyone, any questions? Quiet. So if you have any questions, again, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you out in whichever way I can. That's pretty much it. I don't have anything else other than saying thank you for attending this user group. It's 7 in the morning for me, but I think it's like 7:30 or something in the evening for you guys. So have a wonderful evening.
Hi,
Hey,
it's actually such an informative presentation because I was seeing the Content Hub for the first time. It
okay.
was very interesting. Thank you for such a great presentation. Actually,
Oh, no
it's a
worries.
privilege to have you.
Thank you, and have a good rest of your evening, guys.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
to all the participants also.